Music. That's what I remember. Sweet, calming music. During my childhood, my parents were musicians. My mother played the violin while my father played the flute. I would stay up for hours listening to them play. It was so beautiful, even though I wasn't entirely old enough to appreciate the music. I still loved it with all my little 6-year-old heart. My family and I lived in a small house in the suburbs of California, about 2 hours away from San Francisco. I was homeschooled by my mother, and as such, she taught me the music along with my normal studies. I loved every bit of it, the chords, the notes, the melodies, the harmonies, you name it, and I could play it. From as far back as I could remember, the music always gave me joy and happiness. And then, in one swift moment, the only thing the music brought me was pain. I had just finished some studying when the phone rang and my mother got up to answer it. Hello? Yes? What? When did this happen? Oh, God, yes, I'll be right there. She hung up and turned to me in tears. Emmett, get in the car right now. Daddy's been hurt. Without hesitating, I ran outside and into the back seat. I barely had time to fasten my seatbelt when my mother pulled out of the driveway and onto the main road. We drove for what felt like an eternity. Each time I asked my mother where we were or where we were going, and she only answered, Daddy got hurt. Finally, when I was about ready to scream, I was suddenly distracted by the bright blue and red flashing lights of the fire truck, ambulance, and the police cruiser. My mother ordered me to stay in the car as she ran out to meet an awaiting officer by the side of the road. I tried to hear what they were saying, but couldn't read lips or roll down the window. It was at that moment when I saw it, the twisted, mangled truck that belonged to my father. The glass was shattered. The metal twisted in impossible fashions, and then I saw him, my father, bloody and bent in what used to be the driver's side of the car. He looked like a scarecrow, but the soft straw replaced by metal rods inside of him. His skin was bent, and his body was just as gruesome as the car. I could barely recognize him, but he was dead. That much I knew. I was so distracted by the sight of my father's corpse that I jumped when an officer tapped the window. I opened the door and the officer knelt in front of me. Son, do you know who that man is? My father. He's dead now, isn't he? The last part wasn't nearly as strong as I thought it would be. I found my body suddenly racked with sobs, tears draining down my face like a waterfall after a storm. I couldn't talk, only cry. The officer shook his head and turned to my mother, who was white and shaking, trying with all her strength not to break down in front of me. My mother got in the car and buckled me back in. We drove home. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept seeing my father bloodied and broken in that gnarled car on the highway. I wanted to sleep in my mother's room, but as soon as she got home, she slammed and locked the front door. Hurried up the stairs and into her room, slamming that door behind her as well. God, how I needed her. 3 days later, the funeral was held. I had forgotten how many relatives I had until that moment. They all came up hugging me and sobbing and telling me it was going to be okay. My mother didn't weep as I thought she would. Just like at the crash, just pale and silent. Weeks passed. Months. And finally, 3 years. The entire time was spent with my mother only schooling me, cooking for me, and tucking me in. She kissed me goodnight, but it wasn't the same. We never talked about my father. My mother got rid of all the pictures with a minute. She began sleeping in the guest room downstairs, covered her old room with sheets, and painted the once apple green walls with stark white. She curtained the windows and locked the door. She demanded angrily that I never, ever go into that room. And on my 11th birthday, my mother had gotten me a gift. It was her violin. I knew how to play and was happy, but shocked at the gift. Don't you want it? No, she snapped at me. She stormed into the guest room and slammed the door. That night, I played the violin as quietly as I could. The soft, sweet notes suddenly made me angry. They all spoke the truth. My father was dead, my mother cold and unfeeling, my family abandoned us, and now this stupid fucking violin! I threw the instrument across the room in anger, breaking its neck, silencing it forever. 2 nights later, however, I wish I hadn't. My mother had stayed in her room for the past 2 days. I had checked in on her once, but she shrieked and slammed the door again. I guess it's safe now. I went to my parents' old bedroom and tried the door, using the key I had stolen off my mother's nightstand. I went in. I smiled. I loved this room. Stark white and all, I didn't care. It reminded me of my kind and gentle father. I smiled and then laughed. He was at peace, and somehow at that moment, so was I. But it only lasted a moment. My mother grabbed the back of my shirt and threw me into the wall. "Stupid child! How dare you disobey me?" she shrieked and began to reach for the key I held. I knew if she got it, all was lost. I would never go into this room. I would never be happy again. I screamed and hollered and cried out for my father. Then my mother shrieked. A pained, awful shriek that made me cringe and sob even more. And then I saw him. Or more, heard him. The sound of a flute playing loudly. It grew so loud I had to cover my ears. My mother screamed and clawed at her head and then ran straight out of the room and tripped down the stairs. She broke her neck. Just like her violin, the voice was familiar. "Daddy?" His voice brought delight to my ears. When I saw him, he was there, really there. "Dad, you're okay!" Your mother was a horrid person, Emmett, and also a daft one. She never could do a good job. This just in. Assumed dead husband, Jacob Hines, was found alive in his house after being locked in by his widowed wife, Emily Hines. Ms. Hines was found dead. In other news, the body of Mr. Jonathan Barrick is still missing after last being seen driving home on Highway 4 almost 4 years ago. She never could do a good job at getting at us, that was.